Welcome to another deep dive. This time we're switching things up a bit. Instead of articles and research papers, we're diving into a novel, Percival Everett's James. Percival Everett.
Ah, interesting choice.
It is. We're going to explore the life and thoughts of the main character, James, to see what his story can teach us about freedom, identity, and the power of language.
Sounds fascinating.
And here's the really interesting part. We're experiencing his world through his personal notebook entries, all mixed in with these dreamlike encounters with figures from history.
Oh, wow. Everett really went for a unique structure with this one, huh?
He did. Instead of just giving us a straightforward narrative, he drops us right into James's stream of consciousness.
Makes the reader work a bit harder. I like it.
Me too. Okay, so who is this James? I gotta say, his voice in these excerpts is super captivating, but also a bit of a mystery.
Well, James is a slave on a Missouri farm just before the Civil War. But he's not your stereotypical portrayal of a slave.
Oh.
This guy is highly intelligent, fiercely independent in his thinking, and deeply, deeply yearns for freedom.
Freedom for himself.
For himself, sure.
Yeah.
But also, he dreams of freedom for all enslaved people.
Wow, ambitious.
Yeah.
One thing that really struck me was his complex relationship with Huck, this young white boy who becomes his friend. It's a connection that seems to push against the rigid social boundaries of that time.
Absolutely. It really speaks to the idea that human connection can transcend even the most oppressive systems. You see Huck, who starts out wary and influenced by all the prejudices of his upbringing, gradually start to recognize James's humanity and intelligence.
Yeah, and that dynamic keeps shifting throughout the story. It really makes both characters reevaluate themselves and the world around them.
It's really clever however it does that.
Then you have James's perspective on religion. He's super skeptical, seeing it as just another way to control enslaved people. Pretty bold stance for a slave to have back then.
It really shows how enslaved people found ways to resist, even when they couldn't physically break free. They questioned the religious ideas used to justify their enslavement.
So they were basically saying, we're not buying it.
Exactly. Asserting their own intellectual autonomy, refusing to be completely defined by the system that was trying to control every aspect of their lives.
It's almost like he's carving out this mental space for himself to think freely, even within the confines of slavery.
I like that. Carving out space. That's a great way to put it.
And speaking of creating space, I'm really intrigued by how James stresses the importance of language. He teaches other slaves about signifying.
Ah, yes.
Signifying.
This subtle way of using language to resist and navigate their reality.
It's more than just communication. Signifying is a form of coded resistance, using language to create agency and build community in the face of oppression.
Finding ways to speak truth to power, even if it has to be hidden between the lines. Exactly. It's really a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of those people. To find ways to carve out these little pockets of autonomy and resistance within a system that was specifically designed to strip them of their humanity.
And James, with his understanding of language and how much power it truly has, becomes a key figure in spreading this subtle rebellion.
It makes you wonder, what would those in power think if they really knew what was being said, the real meaning woven into those conversations?
Right. It kind of throws a wrench in the whole idea of control that slavery was built upon.
If you can't control what someone's thinking and how they communicate, it gets a lot harder to truly subjugate them. And James, through his teachings, is planting those seeds of intellectual and cultural resistance.
It's a really fascinating aspect of his character. He's not just longing for freedom, he's giving others the tools to fight for it on a mental and linguistic level.
He's playing the long game.
Yeah, he really is. But then there's that moment when Miss Watson, the woman who owns him, she decides she's going to sell him downriver to New Orleans, separating him from his family.
Ugh, that's rough.
It feels like a huge turning point in the story.
Absolutely. That threat, the idea of being ripped away from everyone he knows, is what finally pushes James to escape.
So it's a decision born out of desperation, but also a powerful statement about his agency, right? He's not just going to sit back and be a victim of circumstance.
Exactly. He's taking control. And that makes his escape to Jackson Island even more significant.
And that's where he bumps into Huck again, right? This unexpected reunion.
Right. Their reunion on Jackson Island really highlights how complex their bond is. Huck, remember, he's run away from his own abusive father.
Right.
So he's initially pretty wary of James, but they face danger together, and their relationship begins to evolve. It challenges all the preconceived notions they both hold about each other and the world.
So their shared experience of running away, of being these outcasts, forces them to confront their own prejudices and build a connection that goes deeper than societal expectations.
Absolutely. Their circumstances create this space where genuine connection can happen. It's unburdened by the societal constraints that would usually dictate how they interact with one another. It reminds us that even in the darkest of times, human connection can pop up in the most unexpected ways.
And then you have the episode with the wrecked steamboat. It's not just about finding shelter, it's about James finding a whole new world through the books he finds in the wreckage.
Oh, yeah. That's a key moment. That discovery is like a spark that ignites James's intellectual awakening. He finds works by Voltaire, Rousseau, all these Enlightenment thinkers who are all about challenging traditional power structures and advocating for individual liberty.
And these ideas just resonate deeply with James. They fuel his desire for freedom and knowledge.
They give him a language to express the feelings and thoughts he's always had inside him.
And we start to see that in his own notebook entries, right?
Totally. His writing becomes this outlet for his thoughts,
Yeah.
A space where he can wrestle with big ideas and give voice to his experiences.
And it's super interesting to see how different his writing is from the forced dialect he has to use when he's talking to most white people.
It's like code switching, but it also highlights the power dynamics at play.
He's forced to dim his intellect and expressiveness to fit into the narrow box society has created for him.
It reminds me of what W.E.B. Du Bois called double consciousness.
Oh yeah, that sense of having to view yourself through the eyes of the dominant culture while also holding on to your own separate identity.
Right. And for James, that inner identity is one of intellectual curiosity, sharp wit, and a really deep understanding of the world.
So he's juggling these two worlds, and he's incredibly skilled at it. But you can't help but feel how exhausting that must be to constantly code switch and suppress parts of yourself just to survive.
It's a burden a lot of marginalized groups still face today. That pressure to conform to expectations that diminish who they really are.
And James, with his struggles and his mastery of language, really embodies that complexity.
He really does. It makes his journey all the more compelling. That constant balancing act between staying alive and expressing himself. And it makes me wonder what challenges are waiting for him as he continues to search for freedom.
Well, his journey is far from over. He's got a long road ahead filled with danger and tough choices.
He'll encounter con men, face the absurdity of racial stereotypes, and wrestle with his own capacity for violence.
Sounds intense.
It is. But James's journey is a testament to the strength of the human spirit, how we can endure, adapt, and fight for something better.
It seems like we've only just begun to explore James's incredible story.
Well, we're just getting started.
What awaits him and what can we learn from his experiences? We'll find out in our next deep dive. We left off with James escaping to Jackson Island and meeting up with Huck again. Now they're on a steamboat heading north. But it sounds like being on this boat brings a whole new set of problems. It's not exactly smooth sailing, is it?
Not really, no. This steamboat, it becomes like a mini version of the society they're trying to escape. All those racial hierarchies still in place, even in the middle of all this chaos and uncertainty.
You mentioned earlier about how James has to navigate these complex power dynamics, like with the ship's engineer, Brock. He's a free black man, right?
Right.
And then there's Norman, who's passing as white. Can you tell me more about that? It seems like a really tense situation.
It really shows you how sneaky racial prejudice can be. You've got Norman, who's technically passing as white, using that assumed privilege about race are, about one race being superior to another. It just seeps into everything, even a steamboat in the middle of the Mississippi River.
It makes you wonder what's going through James's mind as he sees this messed up dynamic play out. I mean, he's already struggling with his own identity, the masks he has to wear just to get by. To see this happening right in front of him must be both eye-opening and really disheartening.
Oh, for sure. It's a brutal lesson in how power works in this world. And it makes you realize that simply escaping slavery, physically, isn't enough. True freedom means getting rid of that whole system of racial hierarchy that allows for these power imbalances.
So it's like a crash course in the complexities of race and power, the subtle ways prejudice shows up, even when there's no blatant slavery going on.
Absolutely. And James needs to understand all of this if he's going to survive. He needs to be able to read these situations, the unspoken rules, because the society he's moving through is still really hostile to his very existence.
And we see that even more clearly when they come ashore and meet a group of escaped slaves. It's a reminder that James isn't alone in this struggle. There are so many others who have gone through the horrors of slavery and are fighting for their freedom.
This encounter is important because it shows us the wide range of experiences within the Black community. You have people who've given up, people hardened by what they've been through, and people who are still determined to be free.
It seems like a turning point for James. He connects with these other survivors, listens to their stories. Maybe he starts to see his own journey as part of something bigger, like a collective fight for liberation.
It reinforces the idea that freedom isn't just about one person. It's something you fight for together. It also introduces this idea of responsibility, the idea that if you've escaped, you have a duty to help those who are still trapped.
And that's where Sammy comes in. This young woman who has been through so much abuse at the hands of a slave owner named Henderson. James wants to help her, even though it puts his own escape at risk.
Sammy's important because she represents how vulnerable Black women were under slavery. She's been through sexual violence, physical abuse, and psychological manipulation. Her story is a reminder of the specific horrors Black women faced and how race, gender, and power all intersect.
It's a tough story to hear, but it also speaks to James's sense of morality. He could have just focused on saving himself, but he sees his own daughter, Lizzie, in Sammy. He can't just ignore her.
It shows his growing empathy. He understands that their struggles are connected. True freedom can't be achieved alone. It takes a commitment to everyone's liberation.
Which makes his decision to help Sammy escape even more powerful. It's dangerous, selfless, and shows how his understanding of freedom goes beyond just his own personal escape.
Yeah. And their escape, it's a close call. They end up running into the river, with Henderson and his men right behind them. It's a really tense moment, and it reminds us of the constant threat of violence that was just a part of their lives.
Even when they escape, there's always danger right there. It shows just how fragile freedom is, how quickly it can be taken away.
And don't forget, it's not just the external dangers they face. James also has to deal with the emotional fallout of telling Huck who he really is. Their relationship becomes even more strained.
I can imagine. It must have been a total shock for Huck to suddenly find out that the man he relies on, the one who's leading him to freedom, is his father. It must have turned his world upside down.
It forces Huck to confront his own privilege, his own part in a system that has benefited him at the expense of others, even his own father. It's a moment of moral awakening, but it's also confusing and painful.
So he's basically unlearning everything he thought he knew about the world, his place in it, and his relationship with James. And all this while they're on the run, constantly facing danger.
It's a lot to handle. It adds another layer to their relationship. They're dealing with the threats of slavery from the outside and this inner turmoil about who they are and how they're connected.
Then there's the part where James loses his notebook in a storm. It feels like more than just losing something he owns, like he's lost a part of himself.
That notebook represents his intellectual journey, his ability to put his thoughts and experiences into words, his sense of self. Losing it is a huge blow, like a reminder of how easily everything can be taken from him.
He's lost his voice, his way of understanding the world. And to make matters worse, he gets falsely accused of robbing a dead woman. It just shows how easily Black people could be labeled criminals, even in death.
It highlights the deep-seated prejudice in that world. It doesn't matter if James is innocent. The fact that he's Black is enough to make him a suspect. And this forces him to run again, deeper into a society that sees him as dangerous.
He's always having to prove he's not a threat, fighting against the assumptions that paint him as a criminal just because of his skin color.
Exactly. And that pressure, that constant awareness of how the dominant culture sees him, it follows him everywhere. It's a psychological weight that underscores the lasting impact of racial prejudice, even when there are no physical chains.
And then, in a strange twist, he finds himself at the Graham farm, the place where his wife and daughter were sold. It's like fate is giving him a chance to be with his family again, but it's incredibly risky for someone who's running from the law.
It's a real dilemma. He desperately wants to see his family again, but the danger is huge. He's torn between that need for connection and his need to survive. The way he handles this situation tells us a lot about his character, his bravery, and his love for his family.
He's walking a tightrope, trying to balance these competing desires. And he's not just up against the threat of being caught. He also has to deal with the social dynamics of the slave community at Graham's farm. It's not a simple situation. There are varying degrees of acceptance, defiance, and fear among the people there.
And that's what makes this part of the novel so interesting. It shows us the struggles within the enslaved community, the ways people coped with their oppression. You have characters like Luke, who seems to believe Henderson is a good master because he's fair in his cruelty.
It's heartbreaking to see how slavery could twist someone's thinking like that, to make them believe that even a tiny bit of kindness from their oppressor meant they were good.
It shows the mental power of oppression, how it can distort someone's perception and make them doubt their own worth.
It makes James's mission to free his family even more urgent. He knows that being in the system is eating away at their minds and spirits every day.
And that urgency leads to a shocking confrontation between James and the overseer, Hopkins. It's a clash between the brutality of slavery and the desperate desire for freedom.
It feels like things are about to get really intense. This confrontation with Hopkins feels like a major turning point in James's story. What happens next?
Well, that's where we'll pick up in our next deep dive into James.
So that confrontation with the overseer Hopkins you were talking about, it sounds like James finally snaps. What pushes him to that point, to that act of violence?
Well, it's not like it comes out of nowhere.
Yeah.
It's more like everything James has seen, everything he's been through all comes to a head. The cruelty of the slave owners, the way Hopkins treats him like he's not even human, the constant fear for himself and his family, it all just builds up.
I can only imagine the anger and hopelessness he must have been feeling. But Everett doesn't make it a simple revenge story, right?
Right. It's not some heroic moment. It's a cold, calculated choice. And that's what makes it so disturbing. James isn't enjoying the violence. He's doing what he feels he has to do to survive, to protect the people he loves. It makes you, the reader, really face the brutal reality of James's world, a world where sometimes violence is the only thing people understand.
It makes me think about how we tend to romanticize resistance. But often it's not pretty. It's messy, morally complicated, and yeah, sometimes violent. There are no easy answers in a situation like that.
And Everett doesn't try to give us any. He shows us the act just as it is, with all its rawness. It makes you think about the consequences, the moral gray areas. Even when you're fighting against something unjust, there can be a cost, a darkness that creeps in.
And then you have that conversation between James and the dead Hopkins. It's almost like he's forcing him to see his own part in the system, his own role in the violence.
Yeah, it's a powerful scene. James isn't playing the submissive slave anymore. He's in control. He's holding Hopkins accountable, even though he's dead. It shows how deeply he craves justice, how much he needs someone to acknowledge the pain inflicted on him and all the others.
And it highlights how even those so-called good slave owners, like Judge Thatcher, are part of the problem. A system built on exploitation and rehumanization. There's no escaping that truth, no matter how they try to justify it.
James gets that. He understands it on a gut level. And his confrontation with Judge Thatcher is maybe the most intense scene in the whole book. He's got the judge at gunpoint, demanding information about his family. The whole power dynamic is flipped.
And the way he uses language in that scene is like a weapon. He refuses to talk the way they expect him to. Instead, he uses these eloquent, powerful words that totally throw the judge off guard.
It's a perfect example of how language can be used to resist. By taking back his own voice, refusing to be limited by the words they try to force on him, James asserts his humanity. He challenges the very foundation of the system that wants to control him.
He's breaking free from those mental chains, using his mind, his words, to dismantle the power structures that have kept him down for so long.
And by doing that, he inspires others to do the same. He becomes a symbol of hope, leading a group of escaped slaves north towards a future full of uncertainty.
But the novel doesn't give us a happy ending, does it? There's no promise of things getting better for James and the others.
No, it doesn't. The ending is left open. It makes us think about what freedom really means and how hard it is to achieve true equality. It suggests that escaping slavery is just the beginning of a much longer, harder journey.
It's a reminder that the fight for true liberation never ends. It's a constant struggle against systems of oppression that have been around for centuries.
And that's the power of Everett's writing. He doesn't give us easy answers. He makes us face the complexities of race, identity, and freedom. He makes us wrestle with the legacy of slavery that still shapes our world today.
James is a story that stays with you. It makes you think about how those systems of oppression are still at work in our own time and what we can do to change them.
It's a call to action. It's a reminder to never stop fighting for justice and equality, to never settle for anything less, and to remember that the pursuit of freedom is a journey. It's not a destination.
It's been an incredible deep dive into this powerful novel. Thanks for walking us through James's world and helping us understand what it all means.
It's been my pleasure. I hope this conversation inspires you to check out more of Percival Everett's work and to keep talking about these issues. Race, freedom, and the power of language to challenge injustice. These are conversations we need to be having.